The Imperium of Man. It's a bloated, brutal, borderline already fallen empire that keeps on trucking because inertia is a hell of a thing. It's kinda like how a chicken can keep running around with its head cut off, only sometimes the chicken grows another head that stabilizes things a little bit before the new head gets cut off too. Facing threats on all sides, the Imperium of Man is ready to kick the bucket any day now. It has been ready to kick the bucket any day now for the last 10,000 years in universe, 40 years in real life, and it will continue being ready to kick the bucket for so long as the setting exists, I'm sure of it. For those of you awaiting a resolution to Warhammer 40k's story, I'm afraid the clock will always be just a few seconds from midnight. So, well, this begs the question, how the hell does this monstrosity of a realm stay alive? By all means, it should have fallen plenty of time ago, but somehow it just keeps chugging along. Well, luckily for you, I have some answers. To be sure, the Imperium is a rotting corpse, but in the realm of fiction, sometimes a rotting corpse can stick around for quite a while. In fact, sometimes it just gets back up and starts swinging at you. So how about we talk about some reasons the bloated carcass that rules the Milky Way in the 40-somethingth millennia manages to keep going. Some big things it has going for it, how it mitigates the negatives, and maybe even why some of the things the Imperium does wrong are actually right by near complete accident. But before I begin lore dumping, tell me, are you feeling a bit hungry? If so, I know just how to satiate yourself. Factor, the sponsor of this video. Factor is the premier meal delivery service that sends fresh, chef-crafted, and never-frozen meals straight to your front door. Do you know what goes into any other kind of eating? Going to buy the food, preparing your kitchen, waiting for it to cook, cleaning up all the dishes. And with fast food, you still have to go drive to a restaurant and pay a pretty penny for unhealthy meals. Well, with Factor, it just shows up at your door. All you gotta do is pop it in the microwave for 2 minutes and bam, instant food. Even better, it's good for you. There's no seed oils, no refined sugars, no artificial colors or sweeteners. It's healthy for you, be it because it's jam-packed with proteins and more, or just for the simple reason that they don't fill the meals with crap. I like to have Factor in the middle of the night. Cooking at midnight is not a fun thing to do, and Factor means I actually get the food I need when I've been up for 10 hours and only just realized that I should probably eat something. To get yourself some Factor meals today, I've just the thing for you. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code PancreasFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor box, plus free breakfast for 1 year. That's code PancreasFB50 at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free breakfast for 1 year. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with code and qualifying auto-renewing subscription purchase. When you eat, you should only be eating the best, so set yourself up with Factor today. Now then, time to discuss why a brutal dictatorship can have a lot more staying power than it probably should. Barely related, but the opening for this video was something I sat down on my computer and stared at the screen for like 30 minutes trying to figure out. You know, you open a video with some background and all that jazz, right? Ease people in. But it's the Imperium. It's both so broad, where do I start, and also the first thing people learn about 99.9% of the time. So I guess the Imperium is shit. Yeah, that'll work for the opening. The Imperium of Man is something that has repeatedly been in lore in the opening Star Wars-esque text crawl of every 40k book, described as a piece of garbage. It is the cruelest and bloodiest regime imaginable, and on almost every level, the empire that the Emperor of Mankind paved the way for 10,000 years prior to the modern day of the setting is falling apart almost everywhere you look. Even in places like Macragge and Ultramar, where things are fairly decent, things have been better before. Not only was it not the peak of mankind, that being the dark age of technology, but it's well past its own peak of the Great Crusade, and depending on what exactly we're talking about, a few centuries or even millennia after the Great Crusade. It doesn't have the fairly robust efforts into research and whatnot, as well as the powerful leadership of the Great Crusade, nor does it have the relative peace from outside attacks, such as during the Nova Terra Interregnum, ignoring that pale wasting stuff we know nothing about. Nowadays, the god that formed it is dead, and his soul just hasn't gotten the message it's time to leave the corpse, and overall, things suck. This is likely not new information for you. So how does this thing stay around? Let's start easy first. This is without a doubt the most brain-dead reason, but there's a reason too big to fail is a saying. And see, I think in very select circumstances that this can be entirely true. For that matter, another great thing to start with here is Isaac Newton's first law. An object in motion stays in motion. Well, the Imperium of Man is one hell of an object. It is the largest polity in the setting by far, covering almost the entire galaxy to some level. It is an empire of 1,000,000 worlds, which will not too much given that the Milky Way potentially has billions of planets in it. Those planets are spread out across the entire thing. For that million worlds lore blurb alone, there's 2 different reasons why it could be larger than anyone else with only that many planets. One is that it's just a catchy saying, and it has far more than that. The Empire of a Million Worlds sounds a lot better than the Empire of 3,476,268 worlds, doesn't it? The other reason is that it is only roughly a million worlds, but combined that's more than anyone else has. Whatever the case, purely by planets controlled, the Imperium has more territory than anyone else. What that means is far more resources than anyone else can field. Plenty of factions in the setting have better technology than the Imperium. The Eldar, the Necrons, the Leagues of Autan. Hell, depending on the time period and how you view their tech, the Orcs can be argued to have better tech than the Imperium. But with the potential exception of the Eldar, because GW is turning Wraithbow into just stuff now since they hate things being fun, all of those things require something. From Necron tech that might as well be magic to the Tau expanding to suit their needs, all of these things require the catch-all category of resources to function. You need X for Y to work, and while the Imperium's Y doesn't always work, you can bet they have a whole boatload of X by virtue of how much space they own. It's almost impossible to properly describe, because how do you quantify something like the iron content of an entire galaxy? Like, how many tons of iron exist in the entire Milky Way? I haven't the foggiest idea, but the Imperium can throw a pretty damn good chunk of it into their war machine to turn into tanks. Adamantium and all the other various rare fictional materials are indeed rare in the setting relative to everything else, but the Imperium functionally has an entire galaxy's worth of planets to look through, so I guarantee you those million worlds, even if we take them literally, have plenty of moons and asteroids to mine. Adamantium being rare means there's only a few tens of thousands of planets worth of the stuff, you know? And of course the immediate follow-up to that bit of numbers is the numbers of manpower. As has been said both in lore and by various actual real-life people talking about the Imperium, there's one resource that possesses in numbers beyond anything else: human bodies. In the Imperium of Man, there is no such thing as a manpower shortage, not at large at least. A given battle or guard regiment may be low on manpower. Things happen. A battle takes place and the regiment runs out of reserves and is low on strength for a while. That's sometimes unavoidable. But the Imperial Guard itself doesn't run low on numbers. The Imperial Guard will never not have the numbers to eventually throw into the meat grinder of a given world. Any such instances that occur don't happen because the Imperium lacks soldiers. At worst, the Imperium lacks the ability to send the soldiers it has to the battle before the fight is over. For how this works, it's very simple. To the best of my research, the largest army ever put together in human history was that of the Soviet Union during World War II. 34 million people, which is an utterly insane amount of manpower. This was of course spread out across all branches in different areas of service like supplies and whatnot, but that's still huge. Now, let's do a little thought experiment. Hive cities. Do you know how many people are on them? Because it varies a lot, so I couldn't blame you for not being able to give a solid number. Most people can't because it differs depending from author to author, book to book. But let's go conservative with our estimates and say that the average hive, not hive world, but a single hive, only has as many people on it as currently live on planet Earth. And yes, this is conservative because some people place hive world populations in the quadrillions. If you arm 1% of that hive that totals 8 billion people, you get a military of 80 million people. That's more than twice the size of the largest army we've ever seen in Earth's history, and that's from a single hive. This is one of the reasons the Imperium still stands. Quantity has a quality all its own is a saying that is questionable. Like a million dogshit soldiers still have to be fed and supplied, and will fight worse than 100,000 well-equipped and trained soldiers and cost less to feed. But the Imperium of Man does not deploy a million troopers in its army. It does not deploy billions. It deploys at the bare minimum trillions across the various fronts it faces. And we've never actually seen the Imperial Guard properly mobilize against outside threats, because what a lot of people don't know is that the most common thing the Guard is deployed against is rebellious worlds. While the Imperium would lose tens of thousands of worlds to rebels if this was the case, if the Imperial Guard threw the entirety of itself at outside forces, nothing would stand a chance. Trillions of soldiers backed up by millions of pieces of artillery and tanks with hundreds of thousands of different aircraft units raining fire from the sky against whatever faces it. As an Eldar fan, I firmly believe that an Aspect Warrior is worth hundreds of Guardsmen. To be quite frank with you, I think a properly trained and positioned Aspect Warrior is worth a squad of Space Marines. But Aspect Warriors are facing thousands of Guardsmen and chapters worth of Space Marines at once. The sheer crushing bulk of the Imperium of Man has kept itself alive throughout the years because no one else has the numbers to overcome it as a whole. Some certainly could. If all the Tyranids were in one big hive fleet, it might overrun the galaxy, but the various tyrannic wars in different hive fleets show that the Tyranids don't operate like that as one moving mass. The Necrons, meanwhile, are far from united, with Imhotep the Stormlord actively fighting the Silent King as he does his Pariah Nexus stuff. The orcs aren't united in the slightest for all the Ghazghkull is trying. Meanwhile, even relatively united and centralized governments like the Tau, aside from the Farsight, who in the grand scheme of things is a rounding error to a rounding error, simply don't have the numbers to bring down the Imperium. It's only not obliterated every single threat facing it because there's too many threats facing it at once for it to properly focus on any one of them. Before we move on, let me put it in the most pessimistic way possible for the Imperium to explain why it still exists, even giving them as little chance as possible with the reasoning I've been talking about. Imagine a chain of dominoes across the entire galaxy. When the last one falls, the Imperium explodes. It will take that chain of dominoes untold eons to finally fall in totality, simply because of the mind-breaking amount of dominoes that have to fall. Plenty of worlds have fallen, and the Imperium is doomed without a doubt. This isn't even me being an Imperium hater. One of the themes of 40k, at least to my reading, is the cycle of empires. The Eldar are the one that fell, the Imperium is the current one that's falling, and the Tau are rising. But the Imperium has so many resources, so many people, so much everything, that even if you assume the first domino is tipped over and the Imperium has already fallen, it's going to take millennia at least for that message to finally go through and that final domino to go down. For the sake of a little bit of brevity, we'll just combine those things. The Imperium isn't just a single homogeneous mass, in spite of what new model releases might tell you. According to those, the Imperium entirely consists of the Ultramarines and Cadians, with like 20 other dudes hanging around across the galaxy. But no, there's a vast array of different groups with different specialties. Against the threats it faces, it has an answer for everything. Sometimes the Imperium of Man gets in protracted sieges against enemies, be it against rebels or what have you. Well, good thing the Death Corps of Krieg exists, the premier siege experts willing to do whatever it takes to achieve victory. Whatever it takes really just means death, but by God, are they willing to die to achieve victory? Maybe there's a problem you're facing that needs something lighter, or at least a more hit-and-run styled approach. The Talon Desert Raiders are perfect for it, especially if it's in a desert. They'll pop out of the sand like the dune worms and obliterate whatever is giving you trouble. Not entirely sure what you're gonna need? No worries at all, Commander. You can't go wrong with sending in the Cadians. And that's not even mentioning the Space Marines. If there's a thing you can think of, there's a chapter based around it. Ultramarines, in addition to being the objective best, are the all-rounders. Imperial Fists are the siege and defense experts. The Dark Angels are the guys you call in for when you need an incredible amount of war crimes that even the Imperium at large can't bring to the table. I have absolutely no idea in what circumstances you would need Space Marine ninjas, but there's a chapter for that too, the Emperor's Shadows. Ninja/samurai are a throwaway little thing here. The Imperium has so much random crap lying around. They're not even the only spies. The Raven Guard, of course, exists too. If there's a scenario, the Imperium of Man has a response to it. Sometimes the response is just bodies. There's at least one general who actively encourages the idea of walking into landmines to clear them. He's not a Krieger before you ask, and he does at least lead from the front, which does make it confusing how he still lives, but you can't call him a hypocrite at least. But as I said in the first point, they have plenty of those to go around, so if that's the strategy that'll be the most effective, if also the most brutal, it's no problem. As for the power of these things, I am a Xenos fan. If GW didn't have favorites, there'd be a whole lot less scenarios where various factions get their shit pushed in by the Ultramarines. But lore as written, and this is kinda meta, the Imperium has basically the strongest of any category of thing you can think of. And even if they somehow don't, if the Imperium somehow doesn't have the first place trophy in a subject, there's a reason you can find that it doesn't matter, and they still end up having the functionally strongest thing. Let's take the Necrons. The most advanced technology in the setting bar none, capable of coming back from death almost completely reliably, and their basic weapons unmake atoms. It only goes up from there, and the most extreme thing to me is always that one map of the galaxy that they can click on a star with and blow it up. Just annihilate it. With such massive gaps in tech, you'd think that they'd roll over the Imperium regularly, right? Nah. Well, Necron tech is far superior. Apparently it's not so superior that Necrons are immune to something even as simple as a lasgun or a bolter. Basic Imperium troops can fairly reliably fight against Necrons without it being a complete slaughter. It's not necessarily that they can fight optimally, but they're not so far behind that they can't fight at all. And you might think, oh, well, that's just basics versus basics, but going up the tech tree, it still doesn't matter as much. Imperial battleships can fight against Necron tech just fine, especially since the classic strategy of ramming a battleship into another battleship is alive and well in 40k. Necrons may have to contend with the AdMech pulling out of their ass a random piece of techno-magic from the Dark Age that teleports neutron stars into the robotic balls of every Necron warrior for 1,000 light-year radius. But there's arguments to be made that it isn't as bad as it might be making it out, and the Necrons at least have gotten some books where they are allowed to be king shit, especially since someone clearly escaped containment at the GW offices and was allowed to make good Xenos books. Let's look at the Eldar instead. The psychic race that once ruled the entirety of the galaxy and was able to freely reincarnate, surf solar flares like the Silver Surfer, and do anything with their mind magic. Even nowadays, they're the psychic race of the galaxy, with ancient mystics guiding their society across the perils of the day. Surely they'd be more than a match for any human psyker, right? Well, hello there, Magnus the Red. I see you've wiped out every warlock on the battlefield. Now, that's an extreme example, right? He's personally designed by the God Emperor to be a psyker and is a servant of the God of Magic. He's a bit different. But the fact that he exists is in itself proof that the ultimate pinnacle of psychic might does not lie in the race that is known for being psychic. It comes from something born out of humanity. But again, a god made him, so there's weird stuff with that. Let's go down a step still. Varo Tigurius, Chief Librarian of the Ultramarines. He's so strong that he can test the psychic might of the hive mind. Maybe a little bit Mary Sue even with that, but he is also an Ultramarine, so it is ultimately forgivable. Still though, he's doing some stuff that makes the Eldar look pathetic. And again, there are some reasons that this is the case. The Eldar could in theory access their full psychic might, but then they would be immediately eaten by Slaanesh. Instant soul devouring, do not pass go, do not collect $200. So they could utterly destroy an Imperial Psyker they face if they really want to, their existence is just forfeit afterwards. And sometimes it's just favoritism too, but dwelling on that for too long isn't really worth doing. Once you read a few 40k books, you find out pretty quickly who GW cares about. And of course, a reason that is rarely brought up, because a lot of lore fans seem to treat the tabletop with contempt for some reason, is that no one can be too much stronger than anyone else in the 1v1, because then how would you be able to play the fun war game? If the Necrons really were advanced as some lore claims, or the Eldar as psychically powerful as they probably should be, then every match those armies face against an Imperial one would be a wave of the Xeno's hand and 1,000 dead guardsmen, and that doesn't sound terribly fun, even to me. There may be lore reasons, there may be valid explanations, and the technical first place may not actually belong to the Imperium. But functionally, the most powerful of any given thing will lie within the Imperium. Be that because there's a reason the stronger factions can't or won't use something, the Imperium ends up being the strongest one around. And in the case where they somehow aren't, like that Necron World Engine Death Star thing, the Imperium finds a way to blow it up anyways, removing the enemy's superiority and making themselves the strongest again. This segment got a lot more complaint-based than I intended this video to be, so let's move on to something that's less bitchy. Unity may be a strong word for the Imperium, but with my rapidly declining brain power as the march of time continues onward, I haven't a better one. And to be clear, the Imperium is regularly ravaged by rebellion and civil war. The glorious empire of humankind regularly has to send in the Imperial Guard because, as it turns out, no, plenty of people in the Imperium don't actually want to be a part of it. That said, it has remained culturally a lot more together than you'd expect. This is largely because of the efforts of the Ecclesiarchy and the shared faith in the God Emperor, as well as Garfield being proven right and people not being immune to propaganda. Propaganda these nuts. Moving on. The God Emperor of mankind and his worship has been stated, implied, inferred, and every other word like that you can think of to be one of the only reasons the Imperium stays together at all. This shared faith in not only is there a God for mankind, but he guides all of them, has allowed some measure of unity to remain between even the most distant of planets in the entire Imperium. Religion's a unifying force, and it's no surprise that in 40k it's kept people together to some degree. No doubt it helps that you can very easily prove that there were miracles performed by him or people acting in his name, which further spreads that religious unity. Imperial religion isn't totally unified either, of course. Across different Imperial worlds are different cultures, levels of technology, and all different sorts of distinctions that ensure there really isn't one Imperial culture, or at least there isn't one that's 100% all-encompassing. Some Imperials view the Emperor as an Odin-like figure, some as an Abrahamic god, some as a mystical spirit that flows throughout the land. But all of them worship the Emperor. Ecclesiarchy priests are outright trained to be able to connect any pre-existing religions like this on newly rediscovered human worlds with the Emperor, so the worship is redirected essentially. Those differences aren't something the Imperium quashes, at least not violently. It cultivates them to be just a different view of the Emperor of mankind, since his power is so vast that of course he can appear to different people in different methods. As long as you worship the corpse on the throne, you're good. Incidentally, that also means that heresy, as the Imperium knows it, isn't actually heresy. Heresy is when a belief contradicts existing doctrine, but is at least still nominally the same religion. What the Imperium calls heresy would oftentimes instead be either apostasy, which is abandoning your faith for another, as traitors do with the Chaos Gods, blasphemy, essentially bad-mouthing the faith, or heathenry for Xenos, since they by and large never worship the Emperor to begin with. Heresy just sounds the best to yell at someone, though. It really flows off the tip of the tongue, doesn't it? That being said, conflicts over what could actually be called heresy do happen. You might wonder if all these differing beliefs and cultures within the Imperium fight. The answer is yes all the time, especially because communication between officials is spotty at the best of times. What one priest may say is a perfectly valid interpretation of the Emperor, another might say is blatant chaos nonsense, and the planet gets destroyed because these two priests couldn't or wouldn't talk to each other. While that is an extreme case, plenty of culture clashes occur when, for example, two different Imperial Guard regiments interact. In one of the Caiaphas Cain novels, Cain's regiment was working alongside one from Talarn. The Talarn one was a very pious regiment, or in Cain's words, they were a bunch of emperor botherers who needed to learn how to pull the stick out of their collective asses. The two groups nearly came to blows on several occasions, and while the story somehow ended with Cain being worshipped as a saint by at least some of the Talarn soldiers, other times this occurs in the galaxy aren't resolved nearly as peacefully, or ironically. Most people don't have Cain's way with words or the loyalty of his troops, and without someone or several someones to keep them in line, different worlds frequently are at each other's throats over dogmatic differences. This applies to normal cultural differences as well, not just religious ones. Some Imperial worlds are cyberpunk dystopias, others are basically a planet-wide version of Whiterun. Of course there'll be difficulties in people from these two planets interacting, so how the hell can you call the Imperium unified still? Well, it turns out when you have the same common god and goals, the potential for getting along is at least always there. People come to blows plenty, but there is common ground for everyone in the Imperium to at least try and meet each other on before reaching for the last gun. The entire Imperium shares that common religious viewpoint, so there's the level of common ground to be found, and everyone can theoretically work from there. As much as there are also many differences, Imperial priests and of course Inquisitors do ensure that there isn't something vastly different. If you clearly worship Khorne but you just call him the Emperor, then no, you're not allowed to continue that worship, you're just gonna die. Well, I won't say the cultural differences from world to world are trivialities. Any sufficiently outlying culture will either be changed or purged by Imperial officials. Most worlds are close enough together that isn't a completely different culture. There's also the old saying of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. With how much emphasis is placed on the holy human form, there's a level of camaraderie inherent with any other human world, especially in the galaxy of 40k. 10,000 years of being taught to abhor the Xeno and whatnot has ensured that even though plenty of planets would happily go to war with each other, they likely hold off even if only because those scary aliens are still out there. Why waste bullets on each other when there's a perfectly good Eldar craft world we just detected? Hate's a strong motivator, and the Imperium, if nothing else, is perfectly good at directing that hate towards others. Whether or not it's deserved, it's a case-by-case basis, because while I'll defend the Eldar to the death, I can't exactly fault someone for disliking Tyranids. But either way, mankind is united in despising things that aren't human, which keeps everyone held together at least a bit. And chaos too, of course, but that's a given. Of course you should hate literal demons. They're demons. Kinda goes with the name that they're evil. And to once again cap off the segment with the worst case scenarios, the Imperium is actually fairly tolerant of shenanigans, as long as they don't disrupt larger quotas and tithes. Planetary governors and their families are feudal politics taken to the extreme, with the amount of them dying peacefully of old age probably exponentially outnumbered by the amount of them assassinated by their children. Planets also do go to war with each other sometimes because the Imperium itself is a feudal monstrosity. Any kind of direct governance by the Imperium at large for the most part isn't a thing on a given world. They just want you to behave enough that you send your tithes in and continue to do so in the future. But if you do pay your tithe and don't interrupt someone else's tithe, you have at least some free reign to get a bit silly with things. Blow up some of your neighboring planet's facilities because you don't like them. Do a little bit of purging of what you see as heresy on a nearby world. It's not an unlimited check for fratricide, but there is also at least one faction in the Inquisition that thinks the Imperium needs more war and that such conflicts strengthen humanity, so sometimes this is actually encouraged. And if nothing else, there will always be a bigger problem than two planets barely into the space age chucking missiles at each other. So it turns out the baseline for unity is also just a lot lower than what we might think of it as, because if the peasants still throw together their taxes on time, then if they stab each other isn't really that big of a deal to Imperial officials. You can find some version of the 30 Years' War raging almost anywhere in the Imperium if you look hard enough, but killing enough schmucks to put a dent in the tithes is actually so hard that it's tolerated. Maybe not allowed, but again, if the taxes are paid in full, then it'll be accepted. Now, I am in some ways going to be giving the Administratum credit here, but please hear me out. The Adeptus Administratum is the bureaucracy of the Imperium of Man. It's the billion-strong organization of pencil pushers, red tape, and more that is frequently called one of the worst things about the Imperium. Entire planets are just forgotten about, a comma being put in the wrong spot can mean systems starved to death, and there's at least one system going through a civil war because they've run out of storage space. They're not arguing a planetary system is tearing itself apart because no one has room to store people's social security numbers anymore. Just about everyone hates them because of how inefficient they are, with the militant forces wishing they could just give the clerks lasguns and ship them off, and even the Inquisition despising how difficult it is to find out the truth from all the red tape in the organization. When the secret police wish things could be more transparent and cut and dry, you know you've reached a special level of hell. Gilliman almost certainly just cries whenever he has to deal with them, at least on the inside. And yet, it is still around. The organization, though it regularly ruins entire wars because some clerk fucked up and sent reinforcement to the Lucian system instead of the Lucius system, still manages to keep the guard mostly fed, mostly supplied, mostly reinforced. It isn't pretty, it's by no means efficient, but it works just well enough. 20% of the time is apparently enough to keep the Imperium's paperwork chugging along, even if only because eventually an Inquisitor will get involved and start shooting people until we can bump that number up to 30% in a given area. Speaking of, the Inquisition is in no small part why the Imperium is still together. Now, this isn't me saying the Inquisition is itself always effective. For a fun little stat for you, the majority of Inquisitors who call in their first exterminatus are then promptly stripped of Inquisitor status and executed for heresy. Life is the Emperor's currency after all, so wasting it is bankrupting God, but the Inquisition has arguably kept the Imperium together in a way more effectively than anything else, purely by existing. The Inquisition is the watchdog of the Imperium, ensuring everything is kept in compliance with what is good and ensuring no corrupting outside influence creeps its way in. As with most secret police, the threat of them showing up is oftentimes greater than their ability to actually show up. If the Inquisition was truly everywhere, then there wouldn't ever be chaos cults. But there's nothing that will scare an Imperial more than someone in a trench coat flashing an inquisitorial rosette and saying that they need to speak with them. From the highest of nobles to the lowest of hive scum, the Inquisition is an organization to be feared, and even the Space Marines themselves need to tread warily. For every instance like the Months of Shame, where the Space Wolves go to war with the Inquisition with basically zero lasting consequences, there's someone like the Celestial Lions who get purged almost to a man for questioning the organization. Any deviances from what's accepted are investigated and quelled. Anyone important who strays will be firmly reminded of their place, and important enough to not be killed on the spot tends to be limited to Space Marines, planetary governors, and other Inquisitors. If the first warning doesn't work, there is no second warning. You are more than likely just marked for death, a death that will soon happen because the only people who can tell the Inquisition to shove off are the Custodes. And even then, sometimes the Inquisition still tries to pull rank on them. It doesn't work, but it speaks volumes about the power of the organization and how threatening they are that they think they have a chance at it. Even when an Inquisitor screws themselves, such as the ones who are declared traitors for an unnecessary exterminatus, this still puts the fear of the God Emperor in anyone watching. If your neighboring planet is suddenly turned into a fireball, you aren't gonna do things like ask if the guy who did it was following protocol and was fired for being wasteful. You're gonna put on your good boy face and become the most obedient follower of the Imperium yet seen, because chances are you don't want your planet immolated. By pure numbers, doing it accidentally probably keeps some other threats in line as well. There's probably at least a few gene stealer cults that would have wreaked havoc across entire sectors if the Imperium didn't blow away the world it was on because an Inquisitor saw one dude on it was smoking a bit too much pot. Statistically speaking, at least one completely unnecessary exterminatus has probably ensured a potential threat never got off the ground. Commissars handle this kind of thing as well, albeit in a far less clandestine way. Sometimes commissars do hold sway over as many people as an Inquisitor, as some will have to deal with entire fleets all to their own. Mention is made that these commissars tend to be very stressed alcoholics for trying to manage an entire fleet single-handedly, but they and all the others are doing their own job to keep at least battle lines intact. This is usually done by way of a bolt round to the back of the head of the first person to break rank, so common that it's a tabletop rule of commissars, but again, how morally righteous they're being keeping order isn't the question. They ensure the soldiers continue to fight until the battle is won or they die in a suitably heroic and useful way, and in this, they do their jobs well. The militant organizations of course also help keep things in line, but there are a variety of ways they actually do this beyond the guard method of drowning someone who asked for a 1% tax reduction and enough men to be mistaken for a Tyranid hive fleet. The Adeptus Sororitas do have the Orders Hospitaller, which are genuinely charitable members of the Sisters that help wounded and sick Imperials across the galaxy. When the Imperium sends these gals in, it'll make people feel better about being part of the Imperium, because that's an actual tangible benefit. The vague promises of keeping mankind safe don't really mean anything to the guy in the lower level of a hive city working an 18-hour shift next to what's probably a chaos cultist in disguise. But when that guy breaks his arm, and if he's lucky enough to receive Hospitaller treatment, he'll probably feel better about the whole Imperium thing. The Assassinorum, meanwhile, is like a more direct version of the Inquisition, with less investigation because they're assassins. You send spies to root out who's at fault, not assassins, but they can take out plenty of dissident leaders and any organized resistance to the Imperium. They aren't improving conditions or anything, so similar dissenters might rise again, but then you just send in more assassins like an infinite feedback loop of human rights violations. It keeps things stable if nothing else, at least as stable as the Imperium cares for things to be, like I said before. Various other organizations like the Black Ships deal with more esoteric problems. Psychers are an issue. Even by our moral standards, where we don't turn people into computers, you'd have to deal with them in some way, which in the best case scenario would be something like Prospero, where you guide them and help them control their abilities. When someone can accidentally become a portal to hell, you gotta have some way of keeping that from happening. And while brutal, because their fates are death, becoming Emperor food, or becoming a sanctioned psyker, the Black Ships and the Adeptus Astra Telepathica do deal with them and keep the Imperium safe from such mishaps. They're one of, if not the single largest fleet in the galaxy, ensuring that even with the Psychic Awakening, any newly found Psychers are properly dealt with. Witch burnings no doubt take care of a good chunk of them, but there are organized methods of doing so to ensure it's done on a large scale. With various other organizations, be they the Grey Knights themselves or miscellaneous administratum subordos, the Imperium has some kind of organization for everything. To be as clear as possible, and in the running theme of this video for every segment's end bit, these various organizations by and large do not run well. The Inquisition regularly has mini-secret civil wars, the Administratum is red tape embodied, and pretty much everything else is deeply flawed, with the possible exception of the Adeptus Arbites, and that only avoids being flawed in terms of efficiency because they can find a reason to arrest anyone. These organizations aren't approaching the breaking point happened a few thousand years back, but they've worked just well enough that the entire thing still works, even if only because of what I've said earlier, and these organizations are so massive they just haven't realized they're defunct yet. All of them are hanging on by a thread, but until that thread finally snaps, they'll keep the Imperium running. Inasmuch as you can call anyone a hero in this setting. For the Imperium at least, however, there are a large variety of figures that have gone well above and beyond what could be expected of them, and have single-handedly kept this shit heap going just a bit longer. Let's start large and get smaller. Rabute Guilliman as an individual has probably done more for adding onto the Imperium's lifespan than anyone else. Yes, he stabs things real good with his creator's sword, and as a Primarch, yes, he can take on basically anyone and have a decent shot, but his brain is the real kicker here. There's quite literally no one else better suited to beginning to fix all the problems the Imperium faces. For those of you saying there are better warriors out there, absolutely, but some of them are not even Primarchs. The Imperium doesn't need good warriors. It already has billions, and if that doesn't work, suffocating the enemy by having 10 million Lehman Russes replace a battlefield's oxygen with exhaust fumes is a valid backup strategy you can use. Guilliman is actually fixing systems, or at least making them more stable with a million different band-aid fixes. His Mind and Stellaris skills are so unparalleled that the Avenging Sun could probably even fix the star system in a civil war over filing cabinet space. I doubt he ever would, because the sheer shock of realizing it exists would likely push him to put a bolter in his mouth and pull the trigger, but I bet he could. It isn't just Primarch level characters fixing the Imperium, however, and indeed I'm sure as more loyalist Primarchs keep returning, they'll have less and less impact on everything but Games Workshop stock prices. Imagine people like Kane, however. Amberly Vale regularly makes mention in her notations that soldiers fight harder and for longer than they otherwise would have with Kane around. He just assumes they're trying to look good in front of a commissar, or failing that also just trying not to die like him. He never realizes it's his presence specifically inspiring them. Other commissars like Gaunt, named Space Marines like Titus, Belisarius Call, and him upgrading the Space Marines. None of them work alone, of course, but all of them are going above and beyond to give the Imperium just a bit longer to survive, inspiring, arming, and allowing others to push back their enemies just a little bit farther. Call it skill and intelligence, plot armor, or whatever you want, but time and again, colossal threats in this setting are averted by just a few people standing just a bit taller than anyone else. They likely won't save the Imperium, because no one person can save this monstrosity, but they can save parts of it wherever they go. And sometimes, that's enough. And for those reasons, and probably many more, but I'm creatively bankrupt and can't pull more out of my ass at the moment, the Imperium still stands. It's standing on a shaky, broken leg because the other one was blown off by a plasma blast, but stand it still does. And forevermore will it stand, both for all of the above reasons and because GW executives would commit ritualistic suicide before the clock is finally allowed to strike midnight. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the various things keeping the Imperium alive to my Imperium, keeping this rotting carcass I call a channel going for just a little bit longer. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. I did briefly bring up, but it's really worth restating how much the Imperium's enemies also not being unified helps the Imperium out. Even the Craftworld Eldar aren't always on the same page. Chaos and Orcs are fighting themselves more often than not, the Necrons can sometimes be worse than that, and the only real exceptions of the Tau Empire and the Tyranids do it in a way that it doesn't really matter they're doing things differently. The Tau just aren't big enough to threaten the Imperium yet, the Tyranids are the opposite, where they're so threatening that literally everyone else wants them dealt with. The Imperium, despite being the reigning galactic power, isn't the focus of everyone punching it to death often enough that that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting and keeping it around.